Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us at the webinar today. My name is Hương Ngô, Senior Business Development Manager of Austrade, Vietnam, and I'm your MC today. Before we get started, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. To reduce background noise, we will mute the microphones of all participants. And please note that the quality of audio may fluctuate from time to time during the session. And for our speakers, kindly be mindful to keep yourself muted when you are not presenting. During this session, we also invite your comments and questions, and please look at the chat box on your right-hand side. If you have any questions, please send it to host in the chat box. I will collect the questions and request our speakers to address them at the Q&A session. Please note, Austrade is recording this webinar and may make the recorded version accessible to our internal staff and also general public in our website and other communication means. Let me now quickly run through the agenda today. The webinar will start with the welcome remarks by Ms. Yvonne Chen, Senior Trade Commissioner of Austrade, Vietnam. And after the official welcome, we will kick off the training with Teacher Edu, who will share with you key principles for learning with technology. Following this session, Professor James Tognolini and David Evans from the University of Sydney will walk you through key issues concerning with assessment of STEM lesson and inclusive STEM for all. We will spend the last 15 minutes to 20 minutes for the Q&A session. Okay, so that's the agenda for today. And we are now reaching very large number of attendees. Before we officially start the webinar, I would like to run a quick poll for our speakers to understand where you come from and what you are doing at the moment. So please follow the questions on the right-hand side of the screen and answer the questions by choosing an option which suits you the best. So let's go now with the first questions with the poll. Which country are you in right now? You've got 20 seconds for these questions. So let's go. All right. Thank you, everyone. I hope that you have already had time to answer the first one. The next questions. Are you now primary school teachers, secondary school teachers, university lecturer, or administrators? So please, 20 seconds for you. All right. I would like to ask our host, has it been okay for the second questions? Have you got all of the answer from the participants? Can I go on with the next one? The last questions for the poll today. Are you delivering lesson in English? Yes or no? Please, 10 seconds for you. Okay. Thank you very much, host. I've got all of the information. So I would like now to officially hand over to Ms. Yvonne Chen for her welcome remarks to all of you, the participants. Thank you. Over to you, Yvonne.
Thanks, Hong. Good morning and good afternoon, teachers and educators from ASEAN countries. I'm very honored to welcome you all to today's webinar, Creative Ways of Successful Teaching and Assessment Using Digital Tools in STEM, co-organized by Austrade, Vietnam and the University of Sydney, one of the leading universities in Australia. The initiative of launching a series of professional development for ASEAN teachers is inspired by the education reforms actively undertaken by the government in ASEAN, with the aim to improve education quality in the region. The webinar series have received over 8,000 registrations from school teachers, university lecturers, and education administrators across ASEAN, of which over 2,000 have registered for today's event. In fact, this year is my 5th year working in Vietnam, and I have always been impressed by the dynamics and the progressive changes in education sector in the region. The aspiration for developing a knowledge-based economy is well demonstrated by the importance putting in STEM education. We all know that digital innovation has changed and will continue to shape the way we communicate and work, as well as the way we educate our next generation. Just like today, we are all using webinars. In the context of innovation, I would like to share a quick snapshot of Australia's excellent innovation capabilities, the outcomes of Australia's rigorous STEM education curriculum. Did you know Australia is a country of innovation? Many people around the world, in fact, rely on Australian discoveries and innovations every day. Australia has an extraordinary history of groundbreaking inventions and innovation that have changed the world. Just to name a few, the black box flight recorder, high-speed Wi-Fi, Google Maps, ultrasound, and the polymer technology for banknotes. Australia's unique education and learning style encourages innovative, creative, and independent thinking with real results. Many Australian universities are ranked regularly on the world's best-known ranking system. In the latest 2021 Times Higher Education World University Ranking, 12 universities of Australia were named among the top 200. Last but not least, with 16 Nobel Prize winners, Australia is recognized as both visionary and successful country. In addition to innovations and higher education excellence, I'm sure you also will be keen to know and learn how Australia can bring you diverse professional and learning opportunities, hands-on teaching practice experience, and result-driven research work, particularly in the STEM education. In this teacher training series, Austrade aims to showcase the excellent professional expertise of 4 leading Australian universities. Today, you will hear from the University of Sydney. The University of Sydney is proud to be ranked 1st in Australia and 4th in the world for graduate employability. The Faculty of Arts and Social Science is also renowned for its world's leading teaching and research in 21st century humanities and social science. Now, I would like to introduce to you all the 3 high-profile presenters today. First, Eddie Wu, Australia's local hero in the Australian of the Year Award 2018, and listed as one of the top 10 teachers in the world by the Global Teacher Prize. Eddie is the education ambassador for the University of Sydney and host of ABC children's series, Teenager Thoughts. Second, Professor James Tonolini, Director of Educational Measurement and Assessment Hub of the University of Sydney. James has extensive experience of establishing assessment centers and liaising with representatives at all levels of government and educational organizations in Australia and overseas on assessment, standards, and the use of measurement information in informing system-level planning, monitoring of standards, and utilizing data for improving school-level teaching and learning. Third, Professor David Evans is the convener of the Special and Inclusive Education Destination in the School of Education and Social Work in the University of Sydney. David has delivered courses for more than 600 pre-service and postgraduate students each year. The 3 presenters will have a deep dive on how to teach and inspiring STEM lessons and how to assess learning outcomes effectively in an inclusive learning environment. Today's sections will certainly complement well to the series on planning and designing STEM lessons delivered yesterday if you have attended. Without any further ado, please join me to welcome Eddie to inspire us all with his masterclass, Principle for Learning and Technology. Over to you, Eddie. Thank you and enjoy.
Hello, everyone. It is great to be here with you, and I want to thank Austrade and everyone from the University of Sydney who has made this possible. It is a real joy to speak to you on behalf of Australian education to talk about some of the things that we hope will equip you to be the best educators you possibly can be. I want to thank Yvonne for the very, very warm introduction. The only thing I would like to add in terms of you understanding me is that I am also, in addition to my role at the university, a classroom teacher of mathematics. In fact, I am speaking to you right now from my high school where I teach. And so for those of you in the room who yourselves are educators who are in the classroom every day, I want to say that everything I'm about to share with you comes out of my lived experience, and my desire is to support you as best as I can as a fellow teacher, as a fellow educator. So you can see that the title of my session with you today is Principles for Learning with Technology. And the reason why I have chosen to address the topic in this way is that while I am a mathematics teacher, and I know that several of the teachers here today are STEM teachers who have a deep connection to my subject, I know that we also have educators from all different areas, all different regions, who have access to all different kinds of technology. And so I thought it would not be very helpful if in my presentation I simply told you to use this particular tool or to adopt this particular style because that is the one that I use. Obviously, you will need to understand your own context and know what works best there and also what you have access to, which may be different to what I have access to. However, we can understand a shared set of principles that we can all share, no matter what classroom we are in, no matter what subject we teach, that I think will help you to learn and teach with technology in an effective way. So during my short time with you, I would like to explore 3 different principles that guide me in terms of how I use technology in school and how I support other teachers to use technology in their schools around Australia and the world. Those 3 principles are user-centric design, which is to say we want to be focused on the students and teachers who are using these technologies for learning. Emphasizing higher order thinking, which is a really important aspect of making sure that we are not just using technology to keep our students busy, but actually to help them think very closely. And finally, we will talk about mediating the student-teacher connection. It is wonderful, of course, that we can speak online right now with so many hundreds of you online, but we also recognize that this year has taught us a lot about what it means to teach and learn in a remote way when our students are not in the room with us, but on the other end of a camera. So we're going to be talking about that connection and how technology can aid with that. So we are going to begin with user-centric design, and the easiest way to explain what user-centric design is to provide a bit of a contrast, to show you what user-centric design is not. I'd like to take your mind back about 25 or 30 years to the advent of the video disc. This is a quote from a piece of research out of 2 educational researchers who were looking at video discs in education. And here, from the other side of the millennium, was their bold declaration about this technology in their classrooms. The use of video discs in classroom instruction is increasing every year and promises to revolutionize what will happen in the classroom of tomorrow. Now, I can speak with some degree of confidence and say that it is very unlikely that any of you in any way are using video discs as a part of your everyday teaching and learning, let alone that use of video discs has revolutionized what your classroom looks like today. And I think that this is a very common trend. We have new technologies, and we can see things like throughout history, going from the top left and going clockwise around this image, the printing press, the personal computer, the internet, mobile phones, of course, and smartphones today, and even a technology as ancient as the blackboard or the whiteboard, which we often don't think of as a technology, but when it was first introduced, really did represent a whole new way of teaching. One of the dangers that we all fall into is that when a new technology presents itself, it is tempting, like the two researchers who I quoted in the previous slide, to have our design of learning and education around the technology. What is this technology good at? What things does it enable us to do? And therefore, creating lessons or programs or understanding topics through the lens of this technology. But what I want to suggest is that a better way to integrate learning and technology is to actually, instead of starting centered on the technology, is to be centered on the users. And what I mentioned before was the students and teachers as the primary users of this technology. And let me give you an example of this from my own work. I have been teaching for approximately 13 years. And for me, one of the things that I have been doing more recently, or for about the last 8 years now, is that when I go into my classroom, I bring a lot of equipment with me. I do not just bring my whiteboard markers. I do not just bring calculators and rulers. I also bring a camera and a tripod, as you can see in this image. And what I do is that every day for the last 8 years, I have recorded every single lesson that I have taught, and I upload them online to the YouTube channel that you can see on the right-hand side of the screen. Now, the reason I did this was because it was a user-centric design. 8 years ago, I taught a student in my class who was diagnosed with cancer. And as a consequence of his diagnosis, he spent many, many weeks and months away from school in hospital receiving treatment. And during this time, it was obviously very difficult for this student to keep up learning with his peers, with the people in my classroom, those students who normally would sit next to him, but now were very, very distant from him. And I'm not sure if there's anyone else in the room who can feel the same thing that I felt when I thought to myself, I cannot just give this student a textbook and hope that this will be sufficient to support his learning while he is away from class. For me, mathematics is a subject that I struggled with at school, and if you handed me a textbook and told me to learn it just by reading, I would have had a very difficult time. I knew that I needed to have things explained to me in a personal way that connected to me and helped me to understand. And that is why I took a phone out of my pocket and I just used the camera in that phone to record my lessons all those years ago and place them online. Now, when I say user-centric design, I mean first that this was something designed around what my student needed. But it wasn't just around what my student needed, it was also around what I as the teacher needed. And many of the teachers here, I'm sure, can feel that sense of being given a technology and expected to use it when actually sometimes it makes your job harder rather than easier. Now, to explain what I mean by that, some of you may have heard of Khan Academy. Now, this is another online video library which includes all kinds of resources for learning many different subjects. But the thing that you will notice about it is that rather than seeing a person, you see what someone is writing on a computer, on a tablet, and then you hear the teacher's voice. And it all began with, Salman Khan many years ago, just doing it in his bedroom. Now, for me, this is a great idea, but I could not do this because I did not have the time to teach 2 lessons for every single class that I had. I did not have time to teach my students face-to-face, and then, in the second way, teach in an online way separately for this one student who was unwell. And that is why, as you can see from that image before, I teach in the classroom and record in the classroom at the same time. And so this is a user-centric design of technology for learning, not just for the student, but also for me, the teacher. Now, there are several reasons why this is helpful. Number one, you could call it the path of least resistance in that it is something which made sense for us to use because it was easy and it was also familiar. YouTube is a platform that our students are going to every single day, whether we like it or not. Of course, the main reason that they go there is not education, but entertainment. However, the very fact that I could take my learning materials and make it available to them in a space that they were comfortable with was also really important and made it easier for my students to start using those videos. Not only was it easy for them to start using them, but it was also easy for them to share it. And this is now getting to my last point under user-centric design. It allows for us to design for impact. I mentioned before that I've been teaching for 13 years and I've recorded my lessons for 8 of those years. But the impact of using this user-centered technology is much larger than you would expect from 8 years. I'm going to show you a snapshot of some of the analytics and data behind my YouTube channel and show you what kind of an impact that they have and explain what they mean. Every time I log on to upload a video of my classroom teaching, YouTube tells me how much my videos have been watched. Now, when I go online at the moment, the last time I checked, there was about 4 million hours that people have been watching my videos. Now, even though I am a mathematics teacher, a number like 4 million hours is very difficult to wrap your head around. So I sought to try and understand what that actually meant in terms that were meaningful to me. So you can see there on the right-hand side of the screen some of the calculations that I performed. When you have a look at a normal Australian high school class, the teacher will be in front of that class for 768 hours in the course of a normal year. So once I go through the end of 2020, I can say I've been teaching for about 800 hours. However, if you take that 4 million hour figure that I mentioned before, and you divide by what a normal classroom teacher will do, you can see that my YouTube channel has had an impact somewhat equivalent to more than 5,000 years of me standing in front of students and actually teaching them face-to-face. It is, of course, very different from teaching face-to-face, and we will get to that a little bit later in my presentation. But the sheer impact and volume of this, and the fact that these are now students not just in my classroom, not just in my country, but even in several of yours, to me is a real indicator of the impact that user-centric design can have. So that was the first principle that I wanted to mention, and this is something that applies to all technologies and all key learning areas. But I want to think more carefully about this second principle, which is that we want to use technologies that help our students with higher order thinking. Now, it is important that I explain what I mean by higher order thinking so that we are all on the same page. When we think about what our students are learning and the skills that they are adopting, that we are helping them to develop, there are many different skills that we want them to gain. For example, we might want our students to know and remember the particular years in our country's history where important things happened and who did those things. We might want our students to be able to apply an understanding of a chemical reaction to, for instance, a cooking process that they might have in their own home. And so you can see as we go further up this diagram, which some of you may recognize as Bloom's taxonomy, we are going to higher and more challenging types of thinking. It is a necessary idea to remember and recall ideas, but if that is all our students are doing, then that is a very low level type of learning that our students are actually experiencing. And this is the problem with many technologies that are associated with learning. I am not going to single any of them out by name, but if you go onto any website or onto any app store and just have a look at the different kinds of software that are available for learning different subjects, I've just picked the ones that are related to my subject here. What you will find is that many of those technologies focus on low-level thinking. For example, can we test our students on their ability to learn their times tables facts and then be able to recall them in a fast way? Now, of course, times tables are a very useful piece of knowledge, but if this is the only thing that our technology can help our students learn, then they will never ascend to those higher levels of thinking that will allow them to adapt to the world around them and to problem solve in challenging circumstances. And so we need to be very critical about the kinds of technology that we give to our students. Even technologies that are highly engaging and interesting to our students may not actually be helping them to learn. what will it be that they gain from a learning point of view from these technologies? Let me give you an example again from my classroom and how this actually works. One of the benefits of having recorded my classroom lessons from the last 8 years is that I can pull out any of my lessons from that time and give them to you as examples. And the two videos that you can see snapshotted here on the screen are both videos you could go and look up after this session if you wanted to know what they explored. But let me explain what you're looking at right now. For me, making sure that my students experience what they're learning is very important. So when I was talking about statistics and probability in my class, I wanted them to understand where the equations that they were working with came from. So on the left-hand side of the screen, you can see a snapshot that shows the end of a lesson whereby we had ended at a point where all of the lesson had landed on this final equation, this very difficult and challenging one at the bottom right hand of my screen. And you can see there I have a little face there that shows the shock of most students when they have a look at a very intimidating equation like that. So when I showed this equation to my students, I wanted them to understand where it came from. But the immediate problem was that no student can answer these questions by hand. Indeed, no one in industry, whether they are in engineering or finance or any other industry that uses mathematics, is going to be getting a pen and paper out to evaluate the answers to this equation. In fact, we use technology to help us evaluate solutions to these questions. And what that allows us to do is focus rather than on thinking, what is the calculation that I'm doing? Can I do it accurately and can I do it quickly? We take that calculation completely out of the picture and we say a piece of technology. On the right-hand side of the screen, you can see it's an online calculator that also can graph these functions called Desmos that I'm using. And I taught my students how to use this software to evaluate the equation that you can see on the left-hand side. So all of that number crunching and all of those algorithms and formulas are taken care of by the technology. And what that allows my students to do is to focus on, well, what questions should we ask? What does it mean when I come up with an answer of 0.67? How can I interpret that? How can I make decisions on the basis of this number? All of those questions, evaluation, critical thinking, creating new solutions off of the answers that we've created, these are the things which are higher order. And this is very, very important. Lastly, on this higher order thinking, I think this is important that we recognize this is a trend that has been throughout history, and we need to remember it even as we go into digital tools. What you're seeing on screen, for example, is a tool that might be familiar to some of you from when you learned mathematics at school. This is, of course, a slide rule. And what it does is enables us to carry out calculations with logarithms and exponentials in a way that doesn't require us to have all of those numbers in our mind at the same time. Now, of course, a tool like this requires understanding and teaching to be used effectively, but the point of it is that just like digital tools, just like the internet, just like smartphones, just like the personal computer, all of these things allow us to outsource our thinking and use mechanical minds that can help us to answer questions, just like machines are mechanical muscles that enable us to lift things that will be impossible for any human being. So those are the first two principles. Before I go on to the final principle, mediating the student-teacher connection, I know one of the questions many of you will be asking about is the students who are in my classroom. Do I seek the consent of my students when I am recording class sessions? The answer to that question is yes, I do seek consent from them. It is really important that my students understand why I am recording the lesson. And also, as you can see, if I just go back to this slide over here, you can see that when you watch the video, in fact, no students are identifiable, even though you can hear their voices and their questions and their discussion. It is important to me that you cannot identify them there for their own privacy. But yes, I do ask them because it is important that they know why. And I should point out that, in fact, students are usually very, very comfortable with a camera because they've grown up in a generation unlike you and I who, cameras in our pockets are a much newer development, but this is something that they are used to doing a lot. And in fact, several of them are often asking, can we appear in the video because we would like to be famous on YouTube, which is quite amusing. I usually say no. So that is the first two principles, user-centric design and emphasizing higher order thinking. Let me now turn to the third principle, which is mediating the student-teacher connection. To explain what I mean by the student-teacher connection, I'd like to give a little bit of context. In Australia, all teachers work under a framework called the Australian Professional Standards for Teachers. It is easy to find online if you search for this phrase, and there are documents created by the Australian Institute for Teacher Standards and Learning that show all of the professional standards that us teachers in Australia regard as the hallmarks of effective teaching. Now, in particular, I want to show you a little bit about what is in this framework. What are the ways that Australian teachers judge ourselves on by, whether a teacher is effective or not? Here are the 7 standards that we use. I know they're quite small, so let me just read out a couple of them that I want to highlight for your attention. They all sit within 3 domains: professional knowledge, practice, and engagement. And I want you to particularly focus on the first 2 standards, which both fall under professional knowledge, because the order of these standards is very important. You might see in standard 2, it says know the content and how to teach it. This is obviously something which is foundational for every teacher. If we do not know the curriculum that we are responsible to teach, then we don't have very much to do in the classroom, and that knowledge is important and central. However, I importantly want you to focus on the fact that there is one standard that comes before knowing the content. There is one standard which AITSL, the organization who wrote this document, recognizes must come first before anything else, and that is knowing students and how they learn. How many of us have experienced times where we have had a teacher who wasn't expert in their subject, but they were unable to connect their subject to us as learners to make that learning and that subject relevant to us, and so as a consequence, we did not learn very effectively. And so that is why in the Australian Professional Standards for Teachers, knowing students and how they learn comes first and is of the utmost priority. Now, this year has, as I mentioned before, been a challenge for all of us, and particularly in terms of knowing students and how they learn. Because unlike when we stand in the classroom, it is an immense challenge to know students and how they learn when what you're looking at is this. In fact, this is exactly what I am looking at right now. I know there are many hundreds of you watching and listening, but in terms of what you are feeling, what you are thinking, these are things which I do not have access to, and that many of us have felt we have not had access to whilst we have been doing online teaching. This has been a severe limitation that the coronavirus has really placed at the center of our experience. And of course, while we hope that our students behind those switched off cameras are attentive and taking notes, the reality is many of them are not. Several of them have trouble engaging with learning online. And that is just to speak of those who are actually able to access technology, have a device, a reliable internet access, even when we restrict to those students. And I know we will talk about accessibility and inclusiveness later on with David's presentation. We know that the level of engagement is sometimes quite low. Now, this forms huge challenges for us as educators. To address something which I know Jim will refer to later on under his talking about assessment, when we think about how to create this student-teacher connection, this is often the formative assessment cycle that really informs teachers in Australia. And I hope this is a phrase that several of you listening have heard of. Essentially, formative assessment is all about understanding where the student is at and regularly making sure we touch base to see what they do understand and what they don't, and importantly, being able to adjust our instruction in response to that. Now, analyzing student responses can be very, very difficult in an online environment. When I think about the contrast between teaching through Zoom or WebEx versus standing in the classroom, there is a world of difference. If you have a look at my students here in the classroom, there is information on the face and the body of every single student you can see in this image. There is excitement, there is confusion, there is exhaustion. All of these different emotions and cognitive states are things that I am wanting as a teacher to be paying close attention to and responding to in my classroom practice. Now, the way that I've described it, it sounds like this is an impossible task when we have technology instead of the classroom as our medium of instruction. But by way of closing off this presentation and getting to Jim's presentation, which I'm very excited about, I want to give you one example of how technology can actually be something that helps us aid the student-teacher connection and make it stronger. What you're having a look at here is a tool that I referred to earlier. This is the dashboard of a Desmos teacher activity. And I want to explain what it is that you're looking at. This particular activity helps students explore motion in mathematics. So this particular example here that you're looking at shows an animation of a man being shot into the air and then lowered down on a parachute. So the question for students is to draw a graph that matches the behavior of the animation that they see on screen. Now, if I were to do something like this in my classroom, I might say, here is a video, I will play it for you, and then I would like all of you to draw it on your book. And then I might ask for a few students to raise their hands and explain to me what their graph looks like and why they thought it would be the case. But obviously, in a large class of 30 or 40 or 50 students, it is very challenging to be able to go to every single student and ask for their response. I would run out of time to teach all of the concepts and skills that really mattered. So inevitably, what will most of us do? We will ask a small number of students to give us their indication, and which students is that likely to be? Often it will be the students who are most confident, who perhaps know that their answer is correct, and so they will tell us what they think. We as the teacher will feel very good because they have gotten the correct answer, and we will move on. But if I were formatively assessing every student in the class, it would become very apparent to me that there will be several students who do not understand, who have misconceptions about how to complete the task, or do not know what it is that I asked them to do in the first place, and so are very confused. So how can technology aid us? When I set this task for my students to do, when they are going through this activity, I get to be on my own device and I get to see this. Now, what you're looking at shows every student in my class in real time and how they are responding to the questions that I've given them. You can see along the left-hand side of the screen, the name of each student is shown, and you can also see a progress bar next to each student's name. This clearly indicates to me, even before I move around the room and have a look at a student's computer or their book, it indicates to me quickly some students have barely started. Some of them are almost finished, and others yet are in between and are still struggling along. But even more than that, if you have a look at the middle of the screen, you can see I don't just know where they are up to, I know what these students have actually inputted as their answers. You can see, for example, on the top screen, there is a graph that goes up and then down, and then it goes to the bottom in a gentle way. And that is what I predict my students should answer. But I also can see several of them have incorrect answers, and I can click on their answers straight away. I can provide them feedback online, or if I am in the classroom with them engaged with this task, I can walk to them and have a conversation. And I can also know what the class's progress through this task is at any point so that I can know if I should move my lesson along faster or if I should do it slower. Again, the point here is that I allow technology to give me an environment that connects me with my students. Some technologies take us away from our students, but I encourage you as an overall principle to think about the technologies that really enable us to know our students better and provide feedback to them that is meaningful. So, in conclusion, before we hear from Jim, the principles that I use in selecting different technologies for teaching my students are, firstly, being user-centered, thinking about what the student needs and also what works for me at my point of learning, which will be different for every single one of you who is listening and watching here today. Secondly, I want to choose technologies that emphasize higher order thinking, not only to conduct and engage in higher order thinking, but to help me see into their higher order thinking and assess what they are doing. And lastly, I want to use technologies that help me to connect better with my students, whether that is something like the Desmos activity you saw just now, or for instance, using Zoom and getting into breakout rooms so that I can interact with students in smaller groups and actually have conversations with them. So I thank you for your time. I know that there are lots of questions coming through and we will get to some of that in the Q&A. But for now, so that we can talk about assessment and also inclusivity, I'm going to pass over to Jim. Thank you.
Thank you, Eddie. That was really great, and it's a pleasure to be on this panel with you. I would like to thank Austrade and every one of the 1,352 participants out there for finding the time to come and listen to us today. I think the last session by Eddie was a really good segue or an introduction to assessment and the way I think about assessment. In fact, he blurred the lines a lot, which I think is appropriate. You know, when he was talking about formative assessment, etc., that if you think about it, what he was talking about was just good teaching. So I can never distinguish, I don't try and distinguish assessment as something I do at the end. It's all part of teaching and learning. And so today, at this presentation, I would like to just start where I normally start when I talk to people about assessment in what do I mean by assessment? I think it's really important for you to answer that question. If we had longer, we'd talk about it. But this is my view about assessment, and I hope that you can see that when we talk about it and try and apply it, that it will be quite useful in the way you work and how you interact with your students and the way you think about assessment. And hopefully, as we said, it can apply to relatively large numbers and in different, you'd be used when people are in different sites, etc. So the definition of assessment is, and the first point is, it's a professional judgment, okay? When you're, as a teacher, you are assessing, you're making professional judgments all the time, but you base it on evidence, what I call you base it upon an image formed by the collection of information about student performance. You saw Eddie's photo there with the class, etc., and he said they're all in different stages. He was smiling at some and some are a bit frowning. While he's talking to those people, he's assessing them. He knows which ones, he said, he knows which ones are going to have trouble, which ones are capable. He structures his assessment accordingly, and so on. So what happens is that is assessment. Professional judgment, he builds up images from looking at them doing their homework, called that formative assessment, watching them in class, seeing what they did on the screen, etc. And he compares that what's coming into the image from what he expects of that student, and on the basis of that, he structures his teaching accordingly. And in that particular line there, it just says, look, you know, if that's our definition of assessment, building up an image, using our professional judgment to collect the data and then analyse the data and help us with teaching and learning, then we use different forms. You saw Eddie just talked about observation, student self-assessment, classroom test examinations. All of them just give you data upon which you can monitor a student's progress. So that's the first thing. That's my definition. This is where I come from when I talk about assessment. And I call this modern assessment theory as a model of assessment. The second point that I make that I want to draw out of modern assessment theory and how I think about it is I think about it in the way when I think children grow as they start, you know, a new subject or they in a skill like problem solving or something. At the bottom, they don't know much. Then as they start to learn from all these different ways, so they progress or grow through an area of learning or skill or knowledge. And by that growth, I don't mean they learn more. Eddie made the point perfectly clear, and I think it's a very good point to make, that as you go up that hill, it isn't that students can do more of the same thing. What they can do is they can use the knowledge that they've picked up at the bottom of that progression or that line there, and as they move up, they can use it to solve problems, to create new knowledge, and so on. So we're talking about a progression towards higher order thinking and higher order thinking skills. So there's the second point. We don't think about comparing children so much as saying, where are they on that journey? Where are they on that road? How far have they progressed? Where's the data or the evidence that I've collected from assessment that enables me to see where they are? And how do I now help those students move towards the peak of that developmental continuum? So, the way I think about assessment and my model that I want you to think about is we view assessment now not so much as comparing kids, who's top, who's second top, who's third, etc., but it's viewed as a process of monitoring a child's progress along a developmental continuum towards being able to apply and use knowledge in the creative ways that Eddie was talking about. And therefore the focus shifts from comparing students to one of your job is to monitor them, to see where they are, collect the evidence and work out a path for them to move on. Whether it's in a class of 1 student or 100, the process is still the same. And therefore I talk a lot about the idea of growth. It's a model based on growth. The way and so if I think about this, and just to show you that hill there goes from lower to higher there, and if we think about that in terms of, as Eddie is talking about in mathematics, down the bottom when children are studying they can count to 30, they can order numbers, read and represent numbers, etc. Well, children who can do that, they're at that level. But as they progress, you can see that they can do more and more cognitively demanding things. As they move towards higher, they can order, read and write any numbers of any size. So they are further along the journey than the people at the bottom there who are counting, etc. And that goes on. Another example, because it doesn't only work in maths, this can work in anything, in art, in English, in skills like problem solving. We can start to map out a progress map which says children who are just starting, they're going to demonstrate these sorts of skills. As they get a bit better, they can do these and so on. This should be captured in your curriculum, and you've got to pull it out so that you can start to see, these students, at the top, towards the top, if you give them a problem, they'll come up with different answers and all sorts of things. The children down the bottom there, they won't even know they've got a problem to work with. And what your job is to work out, where are they? How do you do that? Well, you do it by giving them questions or different questions which enables them to show you where they are. So your job, whether it's online, whether it's in STEM, whether it's in anything, is you've got to think about that development and give them some tasks where you think which will enable them to give you evidence about where they are on their journey. And you tailor the tasks to where you think the child is, which is picked up from all the data and evidence you've talked about, that we talked about and collected in the image. Now I want to show you how you assess that. If I take that developmental continuum, you can see there what I just showed you with problem solving. I can just shift that into a grid there, which has got 4, 3, 2, 1, 0 next to it. That grid is a rubric. But it's a rubric not just says this is the answer to a question, it maps out the journey or the progress of students in that particular skill or piece of knowledge that you're tracking. Here's a rubric for mathematics. You can see a mark of 1 there. If you want to put marks against it, says the student has elementary knowledge, etc. Then the 2, the 3, the 4, 5, up to 5 there, student has extensive knowledge and understanding of the content. So we're starting to write a description of the sorts of things that would mean this person is further along the journey than the person who's got a 1. That descriptor for that rubric for mathematics can be easily converted to a science rubric, a technology rubric, an art rubric, whatever you like, because it's defining the skills, knowledge and attitudes that distinguish performance. If I talk about STEM now just for a moment, the STEM and assessment, I've tried to say there competence in STEM because that's what we're talking about, refers to the ability to combine knowledge, skills and abilities from one or more disciplines to solve problems. And that's what we've been talking a lot about today. So if that's what it is, and I want to assess that, to be able to measure where students are in STEM, then it's a little more challenging than just saying, here, I've taught you that, now I'm going to assess you on that. It's exactly what Eddie was pointing out. How do I create some tasks across the disciplines that make up STEM? How do I create a task which is going to enable those students to demonstrate, the good ones, to be able to demonstrate that they can do higher order thinking? Those students who aren't at that stage yet will be able to do something in that question, which will give me some evidence about where they are on that rubric, and then I can structure my teaching accordingly. So if you think about that, the best way to assess STEM is not through traditional multiple choice, etc., which generally assesses either a skill like problem solving per se, or it assesses a relatively low level skill in science or maths. You need something more challenging to get at that higher order thinking, but at the same time enable the students who aren't up that top yet to be able to see something in there and give you some evidence about what they can do. So I thought for winding up here, I'm going to just go through some hints for writing online assessments for STEM. And these are the hints I would give you. Basically, try and make your tasks, when you're thinking about tasks, to give the students an opportunity to demonstrate what they can do. Think about trying to make them real world context. That's what Eddie talked about a little while ago. Try and make it relevant to them. When you're trying to create some tasks showing whether students can do higher order thinking, don't give them things that you already know the answer to. Our students are trained from birth to be able to not try and answer a question, but to predict what's in the teacher's head so they can get their marks. We've got to get rid of that. We've got to be able to give them a situation and let them define what the task is and the subtasks are. And we want to make these tasks for them in STEM. We would love to make them to be able to do them over a sustained period and to collaborate online, which is my fourth point there. And technology helps this collaboration. You know, students can work together in different areas, you know, at home, etc., on tasks, and they're complex tasks, so they come up and they have to think and talk together to come up with a solution, and then they can present to each other and they can present to the teacher, etc., in ways that we didn't think about before we had technology. And as I said, in the tasks and the challenges that you give, then you should be looking at trying to integrate the different subject areas. They allow different solutions and arrange. And so don't think that there's only one answer to these top questions that you give. When you're thinking of your task to challenge the students, open it up. You might even know the answer yet. So try and create something so that there's no answer. The students work out, I've got to think about this and not think that the teacher knows the answer. I've got to come up with solutions. So then if I think about that, after that, I thought I'd better give you an example of a problem. And here's one that I use fairly regularly when I talk through lots of countries and I'm talking about higher order thinking and the sort of thing we're talking about. I said, given a barometer and a ball of string, how many different ways can you measure the height of the China World Trade Center Tower? Describe them. And so here the students have to think. There is no one answer. There's all sorts of different answers. And when I have done this with students in different countries, the teachers tell me the students can't do that because they haven't done trig yet or something like this. When in actual fact, the students themselves would nod and agree with that until you say, but there are other ways to do this. One way is to just take your string and your barometer and look up who owns the building and go and knock on the door with your barometer and ask them how high it is. It doesn't always need the solutions that teachers have in their heads. So What we want to be able to do is get that ability out to our students that they can work at higher order with higher order thinking skills, and all students can do it. All students can do it. So just as a wind up before I pass over to David, I set out to say to you in terms of different models of assessment, think about assessment differently. It's not something you add on. It's part of the teaching and learning. As such, when you create these sorts of tasks, take advantage of the fact that, you've got some real world experiences. Think about them. Give the students a chance to integrate, work together, use technology to be able to come up with solutions, etc. And make sure that when you give the task, there's a range of solutions, that it adds to that image about where students are in their growth, and you start to tailor your teaching to where they're located along that developmental continuum. And on that note, I would like to pass over to David. Over to you, David.
Thanks very much, Jim. Welcome to everyone. And I'd first of all like to say a big thanks to Austrade for having us here today. And a special thanks to Yvonne and Trin for facilitating this session. I would like to talk with you today about inclusive education and the right of all children to receive a quality, inclusive education. And in talking about this, I suppose I'd also like to recognise my friends in Indonesia, and selamat pagi to those of you from Indonesia who are listening in, about many of the things that they have taught me in regards to inclusive education. One of the outcomes of the COVID pandemic has been the number of children who have been forced into taking their education from home and online. And even in countries like Australia, where our students are now back in school and are actively participating in school, we have a large number of students who have not returned from the time of the lockdown. And that situation and that context is not only in Australia, but it is repeated around the world. We see girls and we see refugees, for example, not returning. And one of the groups in particular that I am most interested in are those students with disabilities. And so I want to talk about students with disabilities over the next 12 or 13 minutes. Another thing about students with disabilities is when we start mentioning the idea of STEM, a lot of people say, "Oh, but they're students with disabilities. How can we teach students with disabilities?" So I want to put it to you that teaching STEM to students with disabilities, like it is for any student, should be a right, and it is something that is a real challenge for us as teachers. The international community has agreed that all children, and I mean all children, will participate in a quality inclusive education. And one of the things about catering for students with disabilities, it should not be seen as separate and different. It should be part of the whole mix of education and how we get all students involved. We need to make sure that curriculum, the state curriculum, the country curriculum is flexible, is relevant and accessible. And it recognises from the outset the diversity and the various needs of all students. It should be relevant, it should be rigorous. And in learning in STEM, activities should be inclusive and accessible. And one of the things that I think is really important is that our students with disabilities, wherever possible, should be learning alongside of their peers without disabilities. In a very recent paper that I've examined, one of the findings of this indicates that students with disability who were educated alongside their peers without disabilities in the regular neighbourhood classroom did better across a number of factors, a number of variables, than students with disabilities who were educated in separate classrooms or in separate schools. Benefits included benefits in literacy, in numeracy, and communication. the world has been, so that's our challenge. The world has been very good at designing the physical environment. And our physical environment, as you can see there, for a person with a mobility issue, can be changed quite dramatically to allow them to participate. That person can go up and down those stairs as you and I can. It's a universally designed physical environment. So how do we universally design an educational environment? How do we universally design a learning environment? The Universal Design for Learning framework, for example, is one approach to achieving this goal. And in that framework, and it's a very extensive framework, there are a number of key variables that I think I have heard from some of the questions and can see in some of the questions from those of you who are listening. For example, in the area of recruiting interest, getting students motivated and interested in it. You saw in Eddie's talk those visions of students being actively engaged, participating in learning that was relevant and very much student focused. So that can be a very fundamental part of it. But some of the things we also need to look at is, well, how do we get students to demonstrate their learning? So now we're talking about Jim's area around learning, and how do we assess it, and how do we track it over time? So having one way of demonstrating learning could be potentially a barrier. We might need to think about multiple ways, and I hope we do think of multiple ways for students to demonstrate their learning. I've heard somebody else talk about the language. How do I get around the language of learning and language of content and language in STEM? Language is a huge barrier. If I don't know the language, it is very difficult to participate. So sometimes we need to teach the language. And in fact, I would be putting that right at the top. Make sure we teach the language for students to engage. Another part of the framework that I think is really important, especially when it comes to students with disabilities, is that we get very focused and hung up on the notion of content. We have to teach this package of content. If we organize ideas and, for example, organize ideas into big ideas, central concepts, and maybe reduce the amount of content that we expect all students to be learning, we can teach all students the really core constructs within an area, whether it be STEM or in STEM areas, whether it be in a language, it could be in the arts, for example. The Australian curriculum, for example, is one curriculum that is flexible. It has multiple dimensions. It has 3 dimensions. And one of the things that I am a great supporter of is that we consider our learners, and if we go back to Eddie's comment about the teaching standards here in Australia, it's about knowing your students. Know your students. Know how they learn. Know the pace that they learn. And help them in terms of learning things really well, those big ideas that we were talking to. Maybe we reduce the amount of content, but increase the amount of 21st century learning skills, literacy and numeracy and communication and ICT and ethical behaviour and problem solving, and in those areas. So let me just take you through a couple of examples. This example here is, I suppose, is focused primarily. Its main focus is around science, and it's around building circuits, around building electrical circuits. And the vision on what is on my left-hand side, we have 2 students who are working busily with a model of electrical circuits, and they're building that. Now, somebody could have recorded a visual of this. There might be written instructions. There might be a number of things that the teacher has done to support and scaffold this. They may also write about it, and they may also draw a picture, a diagram that represents their thinking around this idea of a circuit, and how a circuit, when it's constructed properly, for example, has a power source and can actually actually turn the light on. So in terms of Year 7 content, everybody is working on the content. Everybody. I mean everyone. There are no exceptions here. And if I'm taking Jim's concept of learning, and I'm making professional judgments about how students are engaging in the science area and maybe in the engineering area, I'm sure there'll be some mathematics in there. And that can be around the Year 7 area. But I can also look at those other areas. Literacy. How am I using my language to express or demonstrate ideas around building and designing circuits? How am I using numeracy how do I use maths in this example in a functional, applied way that demonstrates my understanding of mathematics? So the numeracy, the use of mathematics. But there may be students in this class where doing all of those areas, designing, writing about it, drawing about it, talking about it, could be problematic. So their level of knowledge, so they come to you with a lower level of knowledge, but they are still engaged in the content, Year 7 content. They're enrolled in Year 7, they're doing Year 7 content, but they may choose an example of a closed circuit. They may sort the circuits into closed circuits and to open circuits. They may redesign the circuit so that the light will go on. So while the content is the same, some of their literacy and numeracy skills may be being taken from a lower level, and the way that they're demonstrating their problem solving and their evaluation and in Eddie's Bloom's taxonomy may be in a slightly different way. The final example that I would like to take you to has a group of students who come to you with complex needs. They may have multiple impairments. Some of you may view them as students as having a cognitive impairment. They may have a physical impairment, so they have very limited functional movement. But that doesn't excuse us not teaching the content. But we can differ the way that the literacy and the numeracy and the personal and social capabilities. For example, having a personal goal. Many of you who might be working with students with disabilities will think of individual education plans. And they have a goal in their communication plan is to be able to identify when and when they don't want something, or when something applies and when something doesn't. Being able to communicate yes and being able to communicate no. Being able to make that choice is very important. Being able to say yes, the circuit will close, and no, the circuit will not close. When we have those sorts of ideas being expressed, they are age stage appropriate, they're curriculum appropriate for the age of which the learner is at. But they were drawing on lower levels. And these lower levels of literacy and numeracy are not equated to an age. They are part of that developmental continuum that we are actually making judgments, professional judgments about it. You and I use these skills every day. We use them so efficiently that we're not even aware of them. You use time to be here at this presentation, making sure that you were here. You would have walked through doors, positional statements. You would have maybe used money, and you'll have some idea of what the money is and how much it's worth and whether you've got enough to pay for a particular item. All of us use lower order through to higher order sorts of skills. My final example, though, I want to take into the pandemic and being in school and out of school. And I know a couple of you have asked questions in regards to, well, how do I get students interested? How do I make sure that I have the technology, whatever that technology is? I can hear some of you saying, but we don't have the resources to have all this expensive, fancy technology. So the really good solar oven that is on the left-hand side of my screen, well, let's talk about what are the resources I have at home? What are the resources I have in my community that will allow me to build a solar oven? And I can build a solar oven, and we've done this with students here in Sydney, is that we build solar ovens out of material literally out of the rubbish bin. We found aluminium foil, we found a box, we found a couple of items. There's an old cooking tray there, And we experimented with this. So the students, all of these students with mild and moderate intellectual disabilities, they were experimenting with the way that they faced the oven, and if they faced it a certain way, it would heat up. They were able to plot, along with other students without disabilities. They were able to plot using an Excel spreadsheet through a peer-mediated, a peered learning approach, the temperatures and how the temperatures heated up over time. There are lots of things that we can do in regards to that. So finally, I would like to say to you that disability, learning and assessment go hand in hand. It shouldn't be probably disability, because we can all be disabled by some form of environment, but learning and assessment and the student all go together, and all students have the right to a quality inclusive practice. All students have a right to be active learners, and all students have the right to have their learning celebrated. That is, assessed and reported and celebrated. I believe one of the technologies in here is the technology of design, educational design, to make sure that we make learning relevant and rigorous for every student, no matter what skills they bring to the learning environment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. It's wonderful. And now I think we have completed all of the presentations of the speakers today, and I would like to go ahead and take some time to address the questions that participants sent through along the presentations. I've seen many questions coming through, and it is related to the topics of 3 principles that Eddie already introduced, and also it is in relation to some challenges that teachers are now facing, for example, big size class. So one of the questions I received is that, how are we going to apply user-centric design in principles in such big size class? Over to you, Eddie.
Thank you, Huong, and thank you for all of you engaging with our presentations, all 3 of us, Jim, David, and I know you've been furiously thinking hard about what we've been presenting to you, these ideas, and it's great to see you wrestling with the practical details. So I'm going to throw a few thoughts, and then I'm not sure if any of the other panelists have some other ideas too, but I know Huong has a long list of questions. When it comes to large groups of students, I know, the average number of students in a Australian high school is generally 30, though I'm very familiar with the context of, students in classes of 40 or 50 from my work in Singapore and in Africa. So I think that it is important to recognize that I don't view any of the strategies that I mentioned to you today to be ones that would fundamentally fail or only succeed based on a certain class size. To give you an example of this, one of the schools that I work closely here with in Australia, their actual average class size for a primary school, so we have children aged from 5 to 12, is actually 90 students. And so several of the strategies that I've described for you work very ably in those. And so I can understand there might be some skepticism, and I want to try and unpack why that might be the case. I think one of the reasons that we would imagine it difficult to run some of the activities I just described in larger classes is a misconception, I believe, that effective teaching and learning means that all students within a single class environment are all simultaneously engaged in exactly the same task at exactly the same time. I don't think that that is actually an assumption which we need to necessarily incorporate into our teaching and learning. And I think that there is plenty of research to back the fact, and I'm going to refer to some in a second, that in fact having a diversity of different things within our classroom is often the key to ensuring that a large number of students, whether it's 40 or 50 or 90, are all engaged. So one of the pieces of research which I refer to quite frequently from here in Australia is from a different state, Victoria, and I'm giving you the details so that if you would like, you can search these things up yourself as well, so you know I'm not just making it up. The Victorian Department of Education ran a large research report called Scaffolding Numeracy in the Middle Years. scaffolding numeracy in the middle years. A fantastically, well-evidenced piece of research. The middle years that they're referring to are students from approximately age 11 to age 14. Now, one of the most striking findings in this piece of research is that in Year 7 mathematics classes, so these are students who are about 12 years old, even in classes where an attempt has been made to rank the students and place the students with others who are as close as possible to their ability and achievement level, even in a group of 30 students who are grouped together on that basis, on average, a class of 12-year-olds will have an academic range of 8 years between the student who is most struggling and the student who has the highest level of educational attainment. That is the gap on average, which means that in that same class of 12-year-olds, there are students who have not mastered addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division of two-digit numbers. And right beside them, in that same class, are students ready to take on advanced algebra, trigonometry, and calculus. Now, if we can try our very hardest to have a homogeneous, uniform group of students, and yet still have such an incredible diversity and range, then I think we must all accept that there must be diversity in what our students do. And I'll give you two very quick examples of this. Sorry, I know I'm giving a long answer, but I hope it is helpful. Firstly, I would say in a large group, I would say that students should be engaged in smaller groups in a task that has multiple points of entry, and where, for example, students can progress at their own pace, and therefore 5 students over here may be just at the beginning of the task. Another 10 students over here will be engaged in assessing each other's work because they are part the way through. And still again, another 5 students have actually completed tasks but are engaged with peer teaching other members of the class because that is a really important way for them to demonstrate and strengthen their understanding. So even though they are all engaged in the same concept, they are doing it in very different ways. So that's the first thing I would suggest. And the second final one is to go toward, in mathematics, but all key learning areas, what we like to call low floor, high ceiling tasks. This goes to something that Jim was explaining when talking about questions where all of our students have access and they don't have to say, I don't know anything about this, I can't even begin this question, or I actually am very familiar with this concept, I am bored. A low floor, high ceiling task means there is access to a range of student abilities. And one of my favorite examples is having students come up with equations just using the number 4 and combining it with different operations, plus, minus, times, divide, square roots, brackets, to create the numbers 1 to 100. So 4 plus 4 times 4 minus 4 would give me a number between 1 and 100. And then I could use different operations that would give me a different number. Now, for every student who struggles in that class, they can still begin and make progress. But for those most advanced students who would find simple number operations very easy, we can say, I would like you to come up with 2 or 3 or multiple alternatives for every number 1 to 100. And even our most advanced students will be very challenged by a task like that. So a single task with a low barrier to entry, a low floor, but also the ability to expand with the student's abilities, a high ceiling, is really, really valuable for a large student group. Sorry, I know that was long. I hope it was helpful.
That was really helpful, Eddie, because you address the issues of diversity in class and different learning needs and abilities. And I would like to refer also to another question that's about high-order thinking skills development. And also it's also related to the developmental continuum that Jim already mentioned. A lot of participants already asked about, with a big size class, how would we able to raise the questions or create a task for the different learning needs? And how are we going to apply it in a classroom? I think this is common situations in Southeast Asia. Over to you, Eddie, and probably Jim. Thank you.
I'll start off and answer, and then I will hand over to Jim. For me, this comes back to, and David also referred to this, knowing students and how they learn forms a foundation. But then knowing that content and having a mastery of it and a depth of understanding of what the curriculum means, what foundations it's based on and where it's going to are very important. So as an example, because I am a secondary school teacher and my students are aged roughly 12 to 18, it is crucially important for me to have a deep understanding of where my students have come from when they are ages 5 to 11. So even though I'm a secondary teacher, it is my responsibility to know when I have students who are struggling. They've come to my class and I would like to expect that they have a set of core skills that I can assume are ready to go. I need to also be able to diagnose, oh, these students, when I ask them to carry out 75 divided by 3, I'm not just thinking, okay, what happens if I divide 75 into 3 groups? They might be thinking, how many groups of 3 can I divide 75 things into? And we will see students write 75 markers on the page and draw circles around groups of 3, and they will take a very, very long time. Now, for me as a teacher, as a mathematics teacher, to say, I can distinguish between a student who is doing division through partition versus division through quotition, 2 very different concepts but closely related. To be able to have that knowledge of where my students have come from is crucial. And I think the teachers here listening need to understand not just where they've come from, but then also where they are going. Where am I setting up my students for the future that they are going to be learning, whether it's in a vocational context or in tertiary study. So I think that depth of knowledge of the curriculum for every different teacher out there is where we can actually create tasks that match up to wherever our student needs are. Jim, I'm not sure if you wanted to add anything onto that.
No, I think so. I think I want to add to that that is a really important point that you're making there. There's a tradition in assessment to focus on the task, and I think you just hinted at, and which I think is very important, a point we've made today. You've got to focus on the students and try and develop the task to locate where the students are, not think that I've got to do a standardised task that everybody's got to do at the same time, same place, etc. Now, this is quite a significant shift. I think there's a tradition, I think you guys know more than I do in your different countries, on having a test and having a mark, and that mark goes home every week. So our teachers spend a lot of time writing tests, marking them, etc. Whereas I think we should be cutting some of that out, because we already have an image of what students can do. The tests, etc., really just a confirmation of what we know. So my advice there is that, we should be spending more time on trying to develop tasks which do the sorts of things that Eddie's hinted at and David's hinted at. What's a task which is I can do online or face-to-face, whatever, which the students can get access to, and in the task everybody can demonstrate something. And to be able to write those tasks, you've got to have a really good idea, and this is what Eddie just said, of the range of abilities in your class, and where the students are going to need help, the people that David's talking about, how am I going to cater for those? And that comes through your teaching. So it's not, I'm saying, don't think of assessment as something I do to the kids. It's something that's part of the teaching and learning, and I have to therefore spend more time thinking about the sorts of tasks which is going to create the opportunities for all these students to be catered for. And in relation to that, I think we've also got to think about not thinking I've got to give the students the answer to everything. We've got to change the notion of feedback in the way the students should be able to work amongst themselves to generate questions to come and ask you and say, this is what I've got, etc. So they are part of the whole assessment process. And that's why I think it's quite a significant shift. And it addresses a lot of the questions that you've already asked. People ask me what tools I've got to use this sort of thing. Well, I don't go and find a tool. I actually work out how can I find out where my students are in relation to this developmental continuum, etc. And David and Eddie have both talked about formative assessment, watching, working, designing things. That's what teaching's about that's what assessment's about in this modern era. That's how I think. Thank you. David, do you want to add to that?
I thought you did a very good job there, Jim. But I would concur with the notion that if we interpret curriculum very rigidly, and interpret the way that things have to be done, then we are going to disable students, or we're going to actually impair students. We need to be far more flexible in the way that we do it.
I'm just going to jump in one more time before you ask the next question, because I think that, well, number one, David and Jim, when they say things, it reminds me of things which are helpful, and I hope this is something which, again, is consistent among the people who ask questions. Because so many people have asked about specific tools or specific websites that we use, I hope you don't feel, people who are listening in, that we are trying to be evasive. But I think the point that we are all consistently making is it really is not about the tools. Just to give an example, I'm a mathematics teacher, and so I use textbooks all the time when I am teaching my students. But I also know that just because I use a particular textbook, that does not guarantee at all that just because someone else uses the same textbook, that their teaching will be of the same character or the same quality as mine. All of the tools that we can use are really, well, as the name suggests, they are tools in the hands of the teacher. And in fact, it is us who are deciding how we use them. Textbooks can be used to aid students and empower them, and they can also be used to cripple our students and give them a very fixed and narrow view of any subject, but especially mathematics. So that is one of the reasons why we do not want anyone coming away from this thinking, I will just use this particular website or download this program and everything will be fine. As Jim has mentioned multiple times, there is a real mindset shift that needs to happen that is quite separate from whatever tools we may happen to use. And that's why, a lot of people ask me, the equipment, tell me about the equipment and the software that you use to make your videos. And the answer is none of that actually matters. I just started with literally the thing in my pocket, and it wasn't because of this that made those videos useful to people. It was because of the way that I taught. So that's something which I know is a common theme amongst many questions, and we hope that that provides a helpful qualification for why we're answering in the way we do.
Wonderful. Thank you, Eddie and David and Jim. I think that the key message here is that be flexible and spend more time in designing the task and understanding your students to address the diversity in your group. So I think that's the key message. And when talking about the diversities, I receive a lot of questions coming through regarding the students with impairments and students with disability. And some questions ask about disability means physically disabled, or you also mean, for example, students with autism or students with low performance levels. So, David, do you have any tips for the teachers in addressing different groups in the classroom like this? And also, is there any special curriculum for them then, especially in the pandemic context at the moment? Over to you, David, and also Jim and Eddie.
Okay. So when I'm talking about students with disabilities, I'm talking about all students who may have an impairment of some description. Can I just remind you that a student with autism is a student with autism. All students with autism are very, very different. They're very diverse. So trying to establish what you're going to teach on the basis of a label, I think is a potentially wrong thing to do. I think it's going back to know your students, know what motivates them, know what their interests are, know what they bring to the learning context, so you can design a context that's accommodating to their strengths. The other one around curriculum, and I tried to make this very clear up front, and that quote comes from the Global Education Monitoring Report. The notion of different curriculum for students with disabilities, I strongly argue against, and I say to you, if you have a strong, flexible curriculum framework, then all students should be able to be accommodated within that. Because when we go to a different curriculum, one of the things that we do most often is we drop our expectations. We want a separate context. And when we go to a separate context, we lose all of the strengths that all the other students. And finally, if we educate in a separate context, students without disabilities never get to know about students with disabilities. So it's a real catch-22.
Jim and Eddie, we want to comment further on David's sharings.
I'll jump in very briefly just to emphasize, obviously David is certainly the expert, but all of what he just said is very confirmed by my classroom experience. I think one of the most consistent errors that we teachers make is that we would like to categorize students and know this is therefore what I should do in response. But almost universally, that causes problems because of the individual differences between every student and how, for example, I have taught several students with dyslexia, vision difficulty, hearing difficulty, and each one is very different to the others. And so in some ways, understanding the general principles is the foundation, but then taking the time, as we have, all three of us have said multiple occasions, to understand what that means for the particular student is critical. And, I'm just going to go out there just as an example and say, I'm a mathematics teacher, and many people make assumptions about my mathematical ability because despite being born in Australia, I have an Asian background, and there is a stereotype that goes with mathematical ability and that kind of heritage. And that is a terrible mistake. I was a humanities, student focused when I was at school. And so for someone to come to me and say, oh, you must be automatically good at maths would be disastrous and very destructive, in fact. And so that is just a microcosm of how we need to pay attention to individual differences in the classroom every day.
I think just to quickly sum up there from an assessment point of view, what we've all just said there is basically what I promulgated and we've talked about in terms of the developmental continuum. You don't think of anything other than the child. This child is at this stage and this is how they learn. What can I do to help them? It isn't there in this group or anything else, which is what David implied. And so you really have to start to think about taking your curriculum and developing in a way and think about tracking the students along that developmental continuum in a way that's conducive to their particular or their own characteristics. So I think we've reaffirmed what we all said in our talks, which is good.
Well, thanks a lot, the three speakers. It is wonderful. So again, the key message is that flexible curriculum framework. Think about your students and put more time in your design task. So now I would like to come to the last topic, access to technology, especially in the rural areas and in remote areas. So a lot of questions I see here is that I'm living in the rural areas and I don't have access to the technologies. How can I overcome the challenges and still get my students engaging and applying the user-centric discipline as already introduced by Eddie. So I would like to invite Eddie to comment on these issues before we close up the Q&A sessions.
Thank you, Huang, and also thank you to my co-panelists. It's been great to see the interplay between all of our ideas, and Jim is exactly right. Everything that we're saying is in agreement and harmony because these questions address the issues that we have all been working on for many years together. Now, for me, this question about rural context is something that is very deeply personal to me. I know that here in Australia, we have some very remote and rural areas that really struggle to have the same kind of access to educational opportunities that metropolitan areas like the ones that several of us live in have access to and enjoy. And in many ways, the first thing to recognize is there simply is no easy answer for any of this because a lot of the issues that are being faced here are deeply woven into the fabric of our society. However, when it comes to this particular question about how to be engaging with students in their learning, I really deeply believe that technology is not about it is the savior and the answer, and if I have access to this particular program or device, everything will be great. I should point out every single example that I gave today is available free. So many people said, what if I do not have access to a platform like that one which shows all my individualized student responses? That does look like something that you would pay for, but it is not, and I picked it very deliberately because anyone who is watching this has access to the internet, at least at some point, so they can use this platform. And you don't even need to install anything. It is all within a browser and very easy to access. But even for those places where there is simply no electricity. I think it really is important that we recognize student learning, as Jim said in his last answer, it focuses on what that person needs and what is around us and what we have access to. So many times when I think about my students and applying learning to them, it isn't necessarily that the technology is amazing, but that I can think of things that will connect to their context. So I know something that is obviously the front of everyone's mind is the coronavirus this year. And the global pandemic, as awful as it is, gives us a really practical and relevant context for learning. In fact, there's wonderful mathematics to be explored there. I know some people wanted to ask about integrated learning and how we can design projects that engage our students. Pool testing, which I don't know if anyone has heard of on the call, is a wonderful way that we can actually test 8 to 10 times as many people in a population with the same number of physical tests, just by taking advantage of some of the mathematics of chance and probability. Now, I don't need a computer in front of me or computers in front of my students to show my students this. In fact, all I need are some colored pieces of paper to indicate whether someone tests positive or tests negative, and I can do a task with my students that's very engaging and gives them access to the mathematics. So I think that the lesson we want people to take away from that is not to feel limited by the technology. We have so many opportunities out there to connect what we want our students to learn with the context that means something to them. And that's when learning will be engaging.
Wonderful. Thank you, Eddie. David and Jim, do you want to comment further on Eddie's before I close up the Q&A session?
Just one thing I would like to make comment, and I have to or extend my thanks to some teachers in Gunung Kidul in Indonesia who taught me this a couple of years ago, is that they had that same dilemma. It's a fairly remote area, and they said, well, how do we do what you've been talking about? And they were incredibly resourceful in the way that they designed their learning. They didn't have technology as in electronics, but they looked at their community, they looked at their environment, and then utilized the resources from their environment to build exactly what it is they wanted their students to engage with. And that was for all students. That was for a very, very wide-ranging group of students who had skills and strengths, including students with disabilities. But it's always stuck in my mind as being a really good example of how when you think about it and carefully, you can address many of those limitations that you see as being impossible to overcome.
And I totally agree. I just think that, it's not the technology that does anything. I think David did a perfect example a little while ago with his oven. Okay, we haven't got the technology there, but we know what we have to do, and we work with the resources that we've got to be able to achieve our goals. And I think that's what you think about. If I haven't got it, I can't use it. All I can do is go do what I've got, but I'm going to try and help the children with this, and I'm going to put the effort in the other things we can do to achieve the overall goals, which you've all stated. So I totally agree with my two fellow panelists. And thanks, guys, for being on the panel. It's been great. Thanks, fun. Very good.
It's fantastic. Thanks, James, David, and Eddie. Well, I think we are running over the time of our webinar now, and I would like to express our sincere thanks to all of the speakers today, David, James, and Eddie. It's wonderful. So the key message is that learning with technologies, but don't stop ourselves being innovative because of technology. And spend time for the designing task and think about the students as the center of your design task. Thank you very much, Professor and Eddie. It's wonderful. So I would like to close off the webinar today. And before doing that, I would like to thank the speakers, the University of Sydney team who make this event happen. And this is wonderful because it comes into the time that we have pandemic now, and it is really timely and very relevant. I hope that the participants will enjoy the sessions today. And before that, I would like to also thank our Austrade colleagues from Taiwan, from Bangkok, who help us with the technology support today to make all of the webinar sessions go smoothly. Last but not least, I would like to introduce you the next webinar that we would have for next week, Active English Learning Strategy for Blended Hybrid Classroom. And also the next one on the 4th of November, digital tools and strategies for enhancing learning through English as a medium of instructions. They are all related to technologies. But again, please don't depend on technologies to be innovative. Thank you a lot. And I hope to see you again in the next webinar. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.